This is Gregory, 5-Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time may get you to the divine. Today we're going to go back to the deep dive and the important deep well of Catholic matrimony and Catholic dating, and is there a way to find a good traditional Catholic spouse? Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti, Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, secultura in principio, and nunc et semper, et seculi seculorum. Amen. Patris et Filii et Spiritus. Now we do have a playlist here. I mean, this channel's been around 3.5 years. We do have a playlist of maybe 30 videos on Catholic dating, Catholic matrimony, and whatnot. And it's not necessarily connected to Catholic apologetics, but as you know, my channel is called Catholic Apologetics and Living. So there's a lot of episodes that don't have to do with apologetics, because the first year, 2 years, I did a lot of apologetics, and there's only so much you can do on that. So I do a lot of Catholic living, Catholic history, and whatnot. And Catholic matrimony is exceedingly important, right? Anybody who's been married knows that if you pick the right spouse, it can be closest to heaven on earth. And if you pick the wrong spouse, it can be like hell on earth. So we understand on some level that marriage is important. Marriage is a vocation. Some people are meant to be celibate. Christ talks about this in Matthew 19 when he talks about divorce and remarriage. And he says some are meant to be eunuchs, some are meant to be married, some are meant to be single. Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 7 how, in fact, the single religious life is a higher vocation than the married life. That's not to say married life's not important, because God told us we must repopulate the earth, right? Be fruitful and multiply. So of course there is a place for marriage, and you've seen every culture in the world, even disparate cultures that have no contact with each other, man and woman union is the norm. Polyamory is not the norm. Throughout history, it's man, woman. They understand this on all levels. Of course, they don't have sacramental union like we do in the Catholic world, but they understand this. So it is important to find somebody. Now, if you talk to anybody who's looking for a spouse, most of them will hear the chorus of "there's no good Catholics around." And so we're going to really focus on traditional Catholics. So if you're in your 20s, how do you attract and how do you find a good Catholic spouse? Now, understand that when we're young, there's an old saying, we're young, dumb, and full of you-know-what. You know, men are full of you-know-what, that rhymes with dumb. And that we're not necessarily looking for the good, virtue, signaling, trad cath woman always. We're just stupid and want to get laid, right? So our priorities are not necessarily centered. And men and women, I think, are both wired to be shallow, but in different ways, if we're really honest with each other. Women are able to forsake looks for other qualities in men. And that the main quality would be security, provisioning. So, women will, look at Elon Musk. Would women give Elon Musk the time of day if he was a barista? No, it's because he's very wealthy. Now women are like, oh, we're not shallow, we don't look at that. Well, you're wired to look at that from Paleolithic times. Being with someone that can provide and protect guaranteed or optimize your chances of your offspring being healthy and your offspring surviving. So it makes sense that these are things that women will look at. In men who don't have money, we'll say this is shallow. But in the man's world, of course, men are shallow as well, but just in a different way. Men don't care if you're a doctor. Men are going to be looking at what? Beauty, youth, virtue. I mean, these are just things that men are wired to look at. We're much more visual creatures. And whereas women can forsake looks for other qualities, and if you deny this, most relationships, most couples you look at, right, the woman who's beautiful is better looking than the guy. It's almost always the case. But with men are just much more visual. And so the first thing that men are going to look at is beauty. It is what it is. So like where you don't want to be the broke janitor. If you're a guy, what you don't want to be as a girl is somebody who's unattractive or overweight, because sadly that's just the way men are visually kind of wired to look at beauty first. So, and on some level, both sexes are shallow. It's just better to be upfront about it and then deal with it from there. But that being said, what advice would I give? Because you're going to see a lot of people that are nominal Catholics that marry somebody that they just, first of all, like we're making the assumption that you're going to marry a Catholic. A lot of Catholics will marry non-Catholics because they go to a secular university and they fall in love with somebody who's not Catholic, and they're like, yeah, I don't care because I don't really care about my faith. But if I'm making the assumption that you want to find a Catholic, you got to look at true qualities of Catholicism, because I just know so many people who married a Catholic and then later on they figure out their spouse doesn't adhere to most of the Catholic teaching. Many of them want to contracept. Many of them are divorced or divorced their spouse. Like, all these things are kind of anathema to Catholic principles, and this is quite sad. So one of the things you really need to do is, of course, you're going to have, the term is commonly used in the politics, you have to vet the candidate. So when you're looking at a Catholic, again, we're assuming you're going to choose a traditional Catholic, you do have to look at the values. Do the values line up? Look at their parents. Look at their extended family. Have conversations with them. Do you adhere to 100% of what the church teaches? And if they already say, oh no, I believe abortion's okay, or I believe contraception's okay, or I don't believe in, like, these fundamental things that you might believe in, I don't care how beautiful they are, or women, how rich he is, or potentially rich he is, that's out, because these things will blow up later on. Like, compatibility is important, but let me tell you, as a 51-year-old man, similar values is much more important. When I was in my 20s, I was like, oh, I gotta find somebody who likes The Smiths, or likes Friends, the TV show, like things that I had liked, because we'll have things to talk about. And I wasn't looking at values. But the value things will blow up if you have values that are really important. It's not even just religious. So let's say you're super conservative. You're like a conservative Trump person. And then you marry somebody who's a radical leftist, AOC lady. You're going to have problems. So the older you get, you realize that values are, in fact, more important than interests. It's not to say that interests aren't important at all. But you want to find someone whose values line up. Super important. So men, you got to vet the woman. Women, you got to vet the men. And you have to understand that you are the catch, and you want to have standards. So no matter how beautiful or wealthy the other person is, if the person's values don't line up, remember that you will find somebody else. And don't be desperate, don't be a doormat, and settle. And keep dating, go to Catholic Match. I think the best place, Catholic Match is certainly better than Match and these places like that, or other Catholic sites, but really the parish is the best, or Friends of Friends of Friends are the best way. But keep looking and looking, and don't think that I have to be married by 25 or something like that. Now, women, of course, have a biological clock much more than men, so I would say this to men more. Don't feel like you got to get married at 25, because when you put yourself on a timeline, you're more likely to make a desperate action. If you feel like you have to be married at 25, you're just going to, whatever girl you're dating at 24 or courting, you're going to marry, right? This is a scarcity mindset that you really don't want to have. I think another thing that you should vet for is, are you courting and not having sex? Now, I'll be fully honest. When I was in my 20s, I was looking to have sex before marriage. Of course, But I would say that it is important to find somebody who's like, look, we're going to start courting, and we're not going to have sex before unless we get married or during this courtship. And look, this makes sense. This is the way it's been through human history. Like, this idea of having sex before wedlock and normalizing it is only a Western civilization occurrence in the last 50 years. If you go back in time to anywhere in the world, just rampant hypersexuality and promiscuity was looked down upon, even in some cultures you were killed for this. And there's a reason for this. But right now, I will tell you, when you have sex with somebody in the Tinder mindset that we have today, it blinds you from their red flags. So just for common sense, pragmatic reasons, it's best not to have sex. Going back to scarcity mindset, when you have sex with somebody before you marry them, this sex blinds you to maybe they're addicted to drugs or porn or alcohol, or maybe they have rage issues, or whatever it is they're controlling, and you're not going to want to see it because your body is hooked to the endorphins and the morphine or the dopamine high that you get from sex. And so when people are like, oh, you need to stay away from her, she's a rageaholic, you need to stay away from him, he's a control freak. Yeah, you just don't know her. You just don't know her, right? Because you're hooked on this sex. So let me tell you, keep your faculties. The best way to keep your faculties is don't have sex until you get married. And if you find somebody who's like, hey, look, we need to have sex, again, just be patient, wait, because it's the little things. Words really don't mean anything, it's the action. So when you find a guy who's like, yeah, I agree, we're not gonna have sex until we're married, then that is a character check mark. Because, they're really putting it forward, because, guys in their 20s, it's hard. It's hard not to want to have sex. So when you find a guy's like, yeah, I agree, that's a great sign. I will tell you to vet for addictions, because addictions will blow up your marriage. women in particular, I would tell you, you really need to vet the guy for porn. A lot of guys are millennials or Gen Zs. I mean, they are hooked on porn. I'm old enough where we didn't have smartphones, and so you had to go to like video rental stores to get porn, and that was just way too much work. So fortunately, I was never hooked on porn. I don't watch porn. I never had that problem, blessed be God. But a lot of the younger guys do. So women, you got to be looking for alcohol dependence, alcohol addiction, porn addiction. These are big things. Men, for you men, I would tell you, well, porn's not necessarily as much big of a problem, but it's becoming more of a problem with women. But I would tell you, emotional addictions. What do I mean? Like women who can't control their emotions, who rage, who yell, who abuse, verbally abuse. I mean, sadly, there's going to be a lot of women who are like this. They emotion is normal, especially more in women. That's that kind of maternal instinct where if it's redirected though the wrong way and it's not toward children and respect toward their spouse, can be just and the culture kind of supports this, Carrie Underwood videos where the woman's blowing up the guy's car, it's stuff just like, so you're gonna find women who are emotionally abusive, and you need to really vet for that. And of course you need to vet for drinking and for shopping addiction and internet, social media addiction, they're always on that. And so I think these are just some tips, because this video could go on forever. I would just talk to your parents too, because your parents will give you advice on what to find in a spouse. But I think the number one thing to look for is honestly virtue. And I know virtue is almost like a 4-letter word now in the secular world that we live in. And virtue is not even a word that we really even use anymore. But look, especially for you men, look for virtue and modesty. How does she dress? How does she speak? The comportment, as we used to use the word, the comportment. And if she exudes this inner virtue and she reflects that in the way she dresses. She doesn't wear promiscuous outfits. Maybe she wears a chapel veil at church. These are really good signs, but those are outward signs. But also, of course, vet her for the underlying red flags that we just talked about. And also, if she doesn't want to have sex until she's married, these are good things. Now, in closing, you can't be too far, I would say, to the right, where there are going to be men and women who sometimes, because of sexual abuse, use religion as a crutch to be super hyper, I guess, reflexive on the sex part, where they see sex as bad, sex is sinful, and lots of times they'll use the I don't want to have sex till I'm married, because really they have some frigidity issue because sadly of some sexual abuse, and then you won't find that out until you're married, that they don't want to have sex at all, or that they see sex as bad. So you kind of have to vet for that as well. And I know that's an awkward conversation to have with people, but I think it's certainly okay that if you're legitimately, and this isn't for like first date questions, but if you're deep into possible courtship, I think it's totally fine to ask the questions. And you need to answer the question as well. Were you sexually abused as a child? You can ask, was I sexually abused as a child? I know these are awkward questions, but it's the same questions that are just as important as, do you suffer from addictions? I think, of course, you have to ask that. I am mind blown by couples that don't even ask these questions because they live in this rose-colored spectacle world where they want to see their spouse or potential spouse as perfect. No, you need to ask these questions, because as I mentioned in closing, choosing the right spouse is so important on your life in terms of your kids and your family. And you probably know people in your life who they chose the right spouse and they have a beautiful family, and you just see this, like, their marriage isn't perfect, of course, but there's this certain sanctity around their family where it's just beautiful. And then you've seen other marriages where it's just hell on earth, and you don't want to have the latter, right? You want to have the former. So this is just some advice from an older man who's seen a lot. Guys, post in the comments, what's your advice? Or if you're frustrated as a 20-something-year-old looking for a spouse, give your advice in the comments. Until next time, take care, God bless, and pray.